So I kind of thought it was a mixed bag. Um, so I started playing when Metal Raiders was the newest set, and I got out after Dragon Rulers. So in my mind, I've always kind of split all of the formats from 2002 through 2012 into one of three buckets. You've got the classic era, and then the Dad Synchro era, and the Exceed era. Um, I kind of like the older formats better, which is not to take away from players like Billy Brake, who were so dominant then. It just wasn't really my preference. But as for the plant format, I think it was one of the more skill intensive metas of that era. And then Order of Chaos came out and kind of messed everything up, I guess you could say. Yeah, I absolutely think it was too powerful. It was kind of the beginning of the end for a lot of players in my area actually. Um, I don't know if I would say it single-handedly overhauled the game because I felt like the game had kind of been trending in that direction of here's the new set with all this new really busted stuff that you better buy or you can't compete. But Order of Chaos kind of took that and turned the dial up to 11 and the game just started becoming more and more about, repeating the same memorized combos over and over and just hoping you had a good enough opening hand to go off and you couldn't be interacted with and it just got really one-sided. I wasn't really surprised by it, because I felt like it kind of found a way to take advantage of a soft spot in the metagame. Um, I always liked to try to explore stun decks and these anti-meta decks, back when I was playing, and I had this mentality that the surprise factor could go a long way, and just getting in there and cutting all of their outs could go a long way. And I feel like the TG deck kind of became the counter deck of the format. And it's funny because I think Dino Rabbit was initially created to try to be that, but it slowly just kind of became part of the RPS. Um, so I think TG just kind of took up the mantle of being the stun deck, and I wouldn't really chalk it up to luck, but I don't think it was OP in need of a nerf or anything. I think Henderson was just really familiar with the deck and what it could do, and he played it at the perfect time for it to be a meta call. I do think it was ultimately a mistake to not hit any of those decks. From the perspective of advanced format, where you have new cards being released into the pool and a ban list, and it's different in GOAT format, right? Because there's no new cards coming in, so the format's just kind of in this weird cycle where this deck's on top, then that deck's on top. But in advanced, where it's constantly shifting, and you end up with a triangle meta or just a handful of decks making up this large percentage of the top cut. There's really only two ways to bring diversity back to the game. You either have to address those decks with the banned and restricted list, or you have to release new cards that are just so OP that you have to play with the new cards and just abandon the old strategies. And I don't know if they maybe looked at Henderson's TG deck and thought that an outlier just won, so they didn't need to address it, or maybe they had already determined that Dragon Rulers and Spellbooks were gonna eventually be running the show because I'm sure they're making these sets pretty far ahead. Um, but either way, we just kind of ended up with power creep at that time, and not dealing with those decks on the banned list is probably a big part of that. I don't think they did. If I remember correctly, there was a pretty negative, uh, pretty much a lot of negative feedback on that. I think a lot of players felt like they were kind of a cop out. I think it's difficult to sell players on the idea that something like Inzectors were still an up and coming deck simply because they didn't have a first place finish at a YCS at the time of the article. But when they had such a high representation in multiple top cuts, they're not really an up and coming deck anymore in my mind. They're already there, right? It's not always about just what's taken first place. It's about the representation, and there was a definite lack of diversity, and they didn't do anything about it, and it was the articles just kind of felt like an excuse. I stayed in a little bit longer. The Dragon Ruler spellbook format was what finally broke me. Um, I always had a good time playing to a certain degree, but it was never like it was in the older formats. Um, if the same series of events was taking place in my life right now, I would probably enjoy it a little bit more, but at the time, it was just such a drain financially to keep up with the speed at which the meta was evolving. I mean, in the early days, you had a decent startup cost to get your staple cards, your Mirror Force, your Torrential, your Snatch Steal, all that stuff, BLS. And then new things would come out, and you would gradually have to pick up a card here and there. And you would just kind of shuffle things around. And then about the time we got Card Trooper and Stratos, I think it was 2007. Um, I noticed the game was just getting more and more expensive. And don't even get me started on Crush Card. But I'm not sure why it had to be that way. Like maybe this mentality of, well, the next thing has to be even better. Or we're not going to sell any packs. Like maybe it was that, or I don't know, but it almost created this mentality where the game became about nothing but money, and it started breeding this culture in the community where everybody suddenly acted like they were a game store and they had to make 150% profit off of every card, and it got to the point where trading was almost impossible. It was it was just this really weird phenomenon. Like I still don't even really understand what happened there. Um, well, I'm not really sure what happened after Dragon Rulers, but I feel like pretty much every format from 2007 through 2012, the power creep just got a little worse each time. And by 2011, the jumps from format to format were just so drastic. Like every band list, it was like, this is supposed to be our saving grace to try to bring some balance back to this, and it couldn't even come close to touching it. I mean, it was like every time a new set would come out, there was a new archetype, and there was just no such thing as a staple anymore. Your cards didn't retain any value. It was rough. Absolutely. Duelist Grounds was the go-to source for discussion back in this era. I miss it a lot, actually. I was on there all the time. I know you were on there a lot. Um, I interacted with a lot of really cool people on there, really smart people, people who were very passionate about the game. We were all sort of bound together by that love for the game, and it was a special time. And it was always cool, to arrange to meet people at YCSs and put a face with a name. And I think that's why I'm so inspired, by the Goat Duels channel and GoatFormat.com, because they're kind of the modern day versions of Duelist Grounds. The Goat community is great. It's clearly loved by a lot of people, and I like to see that there's veteran players out there who are really trying to foster that love and grow the community. Oh gosh, I mean it's a number of things. I mean, community, obviously, the decks are fun and interactive. There's a nostalgia factor to it that reminds us of simpler times, and even though there's not any new cards being added to the pool, we still see innovation all the time. The meta's evolving, or at the very least cycling. All the theoretical discussions still taking place. The tournament scene's good, both online and now paper. With the Time Wizard events. So it's nice that Konami's taken notice of that. Actually, as a side note, but it's not hard to find an event to jump into, and they're usually managed pretty well, which adds to the tournament experience. I mean, one of the reasons I stopped playing advanced format in 2012 is that the tournament experience had gone downhill as well. Um, Events always seemed to start late. The staff was often rude and not knowledgeable like they were in days gone by. The community was just getting toxic. Everywhere you would turn, there were stories about theft and cheating and harassment. And having a strong community of players and staff to smoothly run the events and kind of be in it together, um, it goes a long way. And shout outs to everybody who's working on that. I mean, this format literally transcends time and generations of players, and it's something that brings us all together. I feel like we're lucky to be a part of it, and we should work hard to protect the integrity of it whenever we can. Yes and no. In terms of the number of people playing Goat format now, I'm a little surprised simply because At the beginning of the revival era, there was no official support. It was, just the true diehard fans of the old school game working to kind of reignite that spark. But once the community started to grow, it spread like wildfire, and that part doesn't surprise me because, like I said, the format is awesome, and so is the community. So, in terms of the innovation we see in the format now compared to the initial run in September of 2005, I'm not really surprised by that, because I think it's important to remember that when a format is the current format in advanced, you only have it for 6 months, and you don't even have the entire card pool at the beginning. So you're kind of getting new things as you go, and you've got a very limited time to refine your ideas and your strategies. So when you revisit it as a retro format, though, you've got the entire card pool, you've got all that historical knowledge, but more importantly, you've got all the time in the world then to experiment and try new things. So I think that kind of gives birth to a new meta game. And while we still see some of the old school strategies, goat control still around, there's new things as well. And I think there's even more to come. So it's fascinating that even though it's over 17 years old, we still get to see new stuff, and the format isn't solved. And I'm not sure that it ever will be.